Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. It's the little things, Macro Photography 102, presented by Dr. Court Whalen. Court has been guiding worldwide with NatHab since 2013 and is our Director of Sustainability and Conservation Travel. Thanks for being with us, Court. I'll hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Kendall. So yeah, I wear a lot of hats around NatHab. I've never really done too much of a formal introduction myself, but one thing that you may not know is that I am an entomologist by trade. That is what the PhD is in. So as a result, I love macro photography. I think it's super duper fun. So we've dedicated 2 full webinars to macro photography, 101 last week and 102 this week. We talked about the basics last time. We're going to be doing like everything else this time. Going back to my academic roots, anytime we do a 101, 102 kind of pairing, there's gonna be some overlap today, but there most gonna be overlap in either some of the real basics to kind of get your footing right in case you haven't yet joined the 101, but then also picking up on some of the more advanced topics of 101 leading into quite literally the rest of sharing, the rest of macro photography, so that really you are up to speed. The way I'm looking at this is it's not necessarily like in the 102 presentation, you are going to learn how to take even better photographs than the techniques I've taught you in 101. It's more like as you get into macro photography, knowing more about what you're getting into, more about all the gear options, there's almost an infinite growth, an infinite amount you can do with macro photography, going, starting with backyard flowers, going all the way to literally photographing like museum specimens. I mean, it's the techniques and the gear, it's quite expansive. So we're going to go over that, and we're going to go over some of the more advanced challenges and opportunities with macro photography. And then true to form, I've got a little bit of homework of assignment, maybe over the long weekend. You can dabble in your backyard or in your home. So we're going to be covering a lot today. And like I said, just to stress that, it's going to be kind of bouncing around from topic to topic so that you leave this webinar understanding everywhere you can go with macro photography. So yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. And so let's start with some of the basics. Why do we love macro photography? Well, again, as an entomologist, I love showcasing the little things in the world. And there are so many little things. We're talking about, 11,000 species of birds in the world, like something like 6,000 species of mammals, and like 10 million species of insects estimated total. So just insects in general, you can do so much, and they're so colorful, they're so textured. There's a lot you can photograph, but of course, when we talk about macro photography, the thing is we are photographing the little things. We're taking big photos of little things is how I like to bring it down. And what is so cool is that with small little scenes, even just like the base of a plant pot or inside of a plant, the palm frond, whatever, small little lizards, small amphibians and geckos and reptiles, they turn into works of art if you do it right. It's a whole other dimension of photography. You still got to use a lot of the same things like rule of thirds and leading lines and things that I talked about in my Nature Photography 101 and 102. But you do so on a different scale. And I think it really, if you've not gotten into it, I encourage you to do so because it opens a very, very big world to you, a very big world of small things. It's quite compelling and quite neat. By the book, though, if you want to know like the actual true definition of macro photography, it has to do with this 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, so you can make a big photo of a little thing, and that's great. I consider it macro, and that's sort of like the colloquial term. Macro is taking big photos of little things, but technically, for it to be true macro, like to buy a macro lens or to be a macro setting, what you're doing is the life size of the object appears that same size in your camera's sensor or in film back in the days. So a true macro photograph is one in which the size of the subject on the sensor, like that little bug or that frog, is the same as in real life. And again, you'll see that 1-to-1 ratio as the nomenclature there. So that's technical macro. So we're gonna be talking about kind of both, sticking with the technical definition, but also bridging and expanding to what is all big photos of little things. And then again, kind of wrapping up the basics here, why it's so great is that you can make lemonade out of lemons all day long. You have a rainy day, you can't photograph, the jaguars in the bushes or the tigers, in India. There's always some cool stuff to photograph macro because not a lot of people do it. It does provide, or it does require some technical equipment. So it's not, quite as available to everybody with a smartphone or with an intro camera. And it provides us a different lens, a different perspective on the world. And you can do so quite literally anywhere. You're going to see some suggestions later on the presentation of how to do so in your kitchen, how to do so in your backyard. So it's something that, yes, it takes some learning, it takes some higher level technique, but the amount in places and times that you can practice are just as infinite to the possibilities within macro photography. It's really cool. So like I said, I'm going to do a relatively expansive section on gear because there is a lot of gear, and I noticed in the past I've gotten a lot of questions about macro gear with other photography presentations. So we're going to spend a good chunk of time on this today, and I actually have my little props right here, my own macro gear I'm going to show you on the screen, but I'm going to have pictures up too. So if you can't quite see what I'm showing, it's on the screen as well. So let's just start off again, kind of delving into the basics a little bit. And then we're going to quickly go over into the more advanced stuff. At very least, you know the gear, a point and shoot camera, and some kind of flash. If you are sticking with point and shoots out there, find this little flower logo or flower icon, hit it, and you are on macro mode, and that most likely will set in that 1-to-1 ratio, maximizing the size of your subject in your sensor and giving you a big photo of a little thing. Sometimes if you can't quite get it just by pushing the button, you might need to be on P or program mode. Sometimes you can actually hold that flower button and it'll go into super macro mode, and you can get even closer and the subject gets even bigger. This is kind of like the easy button. This is the automated way. I would imagine there are a number of people out there in the audience, maybe the majority, that are like me, and you get into this pretty heavy. This is like the whole suite of possibilities out there. And I want to talk about, you know, for the next several minutes about twin lights versus ring lights. I want to talk about the difference in classic macro lenses, you know, your 60 millimeters, your 100 millimeters, your 180s, different types of flashes out there. What about focusing rails? What about bellows? What about reversible lenses? If you have dabbled in macro photography and done some Google searching and watched some YouTube videos, you'll probably notice, again, just so much opportunity out there, but it's kind of confusing. And let's be honest, you know, it's not necessarily the easiest or cheapest entry to some of this stuff. So I want to give you the tools that you need to make the decisions on some of this stuff. I frankly am going to be kind of careful not to give you hard and fast recommendations. I will tell you what I do, but really I want to give you the knowledge of what each offers, and then you can kind of make your own decisions as you go forward in some of this stuff. So before I go into the gears and the flashes, let me just tell you, you know, my go-to start, like the settings that I'm going to put in my camera that I need my gear for is just right here on the right. So it's going to be flash on, aperture of f/16, which is a big aperture, or technically it's a small aperture, but it's a big aperture number. A shutter speed of about 1/200 to eliminate any sort of handshake or hand movement with the camera. I'll go ahead and start holding my camera now. Makes me feel better. So here's my setup. And so, you know, of course, movement of the camera, you're hand holding this stuff if you don't have a tripod, and there's a little bit of hand movement. You can't get too much faster than 1/200 because there's an issue with what's known as flash syncing, sync like SYNC. And then ISO, you're kind of just dialing an ISO to give you the rest of the stuff. As with everything, we want as low as possible, but I usually start with 400 and I'm prepared to go a little bit higher. So again, these are my go-to settings. When I encounter a macro subject, you're going to learn a lot more creative tips than just this, but this is my starting point. Sometimes it might be a butterfly that's going to fly away. Sometimes I might be the photo guide and I want to take one shot to show my group my example, but I'm going to let them take the photographs. I'm going to step back. So if I have one chance in one shot, these are my settings. But as you'll see in a few slides from now, where you can get creative with flash and with aperture and all this other stuff. But nevertheless, so here's the gear I need to make this happen. So you definitely need a flash of some sort. So you'll see I have my twin light here. There are a few manufacturers, including the major camera brands. This is a Canon. It's a Canon flash itself, but there are some third parties. There are some less expensive ones. But you know, with photography, you often get what you pay for. So investing right at the start can often give you better photographs. It can encourage you more. You can like your stuff better and therefore do more. But there's a fundamental difference nowadays in that there's ring lights, which used to be the dominant form, and then these twin lights. Again, there's not one clear winner here. I will tell you with ring lights, they attach on the end. You see, I actually have a ring light, so sometimes like this. Ring light, battery pack. The battery pack slides on the top of the camera. Ring light adjusts and screws on your filter ring on the front of your lens. And with most ring lights, there are like little inserts you can put back here based on what lens you're using. Sometimes it's a 58 millimeter, sometimes a 67. So every manufacturer will provide you inserts to adapt. So I'll start off with what I like about the ring light. I like the ring light because it's inexpensive and you can get good quality for not a lot of money. This I bought off of Amazon. Is, if you can see here, maybe you can see it. It's actually maybe like 80 or 100 little LED bulbs that are all in here, so it preserves battery really well. In addition, it has a video mode where you can just turn on the lights, and it's just a light. It's like a flashlight. It's really good if you want to take video, but more importantly, if you are at night, which a lot of my macro photography is, because I'm in cool places like Borneo and jungles of Madagascar where a lot of these amphibians and insects come out, is that way my camera can focus really easy with that nice bright light. So they're pretty good quality. The only downside is that, and I actually haven't personally seen this a whole lot myself, but the downside that others critique this for is that the flash, because it'll burst one very strong pulse of light, it looks like a flash. So if you know what that means, it looks like in your photograph, you know, say you're photographing a shiny beetle, say you're photographing a leaf with dew on it, it'll look like little rings and look like the flash. Again, I have not noticed that a ton in my photography, but that's the main critique. The other critique, which I have noticed, is it's just not as powerful as the big guy here, as the macro flash twin light. So this guy here is going to be a lot more powerful. It's going to be a lot brighter, and what that translates into is I can basically get a bigger aperture and a wider depth of field because I'm buffering all this with a ton of light injected in my scene. And this is just my personal preference, but I love when I have a very, very wide depth of field with my macro photography. I think it provides all those cool textures and the colors come out really well. So this again is, you know, I use both about half the time, but those are your differences. In addition, the twin lights being much more of a traditional flash, you know, there's no flash up here, it's just the battery. You don't get that same flash imprinting on the photo. You won't really see the flash. You'll see the light, but it won't be a singular flash ring. In addition, these things can move. You can position them, and then within the computer on the back of the camera, you can actually dial in strength on each side. So if you know anything about studio lighting, oftentimes you want a stronger light on one side and a weaker light on the other to mitigate that artificial look or to provide that depth or that intrigue, that mystique. You know, these little beetles that I'm photographing are my models, so I'm thinking very deliberately about that. Okay, flash diffusers. Let's move to that. So again, you know, we'll talk about how to not use flash here in a little bit, but let's say you have a Canon Rebel or a Nikon 7200, something like that. You actually will have a flash built right into your camera, and this is going to be good enough for starters. You know, you might get obsessed with macro photography and you might want to get a different type of flash, you know, one of these dedicated macro flashes I just showed you. But in the meantime, you know, what you might want to do to improve your photography is just buy one of these very, very small flash diffusers. What you'll see, this is basically like a fabric, sometimes it's plastic, and it's designed just to fit and snap and mold over your camera's flash. And what it does is it creates big, soft light. And that's what we want with flash photography up close. Because remember, you know, you are very, very close to these subjects, sometimes within inches, and a diffuser will limit the harsh shadows. It will make it look realistic, and it'll provide more even lighting across the base. So that's one way with pop-up flashes. The other thing you can do is if you do have a top-mounted flash like I have here, this is kind of like your classic, you know, we call it a shoe-mounted flash that sits on top of your camera. They're great. You know, a lot of wedding photographers, portrait photographers, model photographers will have this as their go-to, and this is good. You can do nothing else with it. A lot of these actually have their own diffusers built right into it. Check this out, it's pretty cool. Just folds down, soft, and then this little white panel will actually reflect the light down. So that's quite cool. However, you can go one step further, and if you're finding this light is just too harsh, you can buy one of these little plastic jobbies for about $10 on B&H or Amazon, slide it over the tip, and then you get a nice softer light. You can go one step further, and again, without breaking the bank whatsoever, not spending a lot of money, you can get this thing down here that I have, and this is a softbox, okay? So what this does is, it's pretty rudimentary. It's like a little thing that wraps around the tip of your lens, it velcros and fastens, and what it does, it turns your flash into a much bigger light source. So when you have light coming from a lot of different sources, say the subject's down here, you know, you have light coming from all of this versus just one top-down light. Again, if you're trying to get into this, and for starters, both these last things I just showed you are great investments. These are like just in the tens of dollars at most. But I actually, for a while I was using only my shoe mounted flash because I had this for things like bird photography and portrait photography. You can get away with this for starters very, very easily. However, if you're going out there and buying a flash and your only purpose is to invest in your macro photography setup, these flashes that I showed you in the previous slide that I'll go to here, there, those are your dedicated macro flashes. These are just tricks, kind of like hacks to use what you have. I love repurposing things. I love not spending a lot of money on new gear if I can help it. I love testing the waters with technology. This is something I came across on the internet a while ago. This is an old film canister, and someone took, presumably scissors or a little X-Acto knife and just cut out a little slot to put this on their pop-up flash. I thought this was so inventive. I've tried it myself. It works. It diffuses the light. It's softer. It's not as harsh. So you can invent things like that. I've heard of people just putting white linen or a white piece of paper in front of it. As you test the waters with macro photography and you don't want to spend hundreds of dollars right off the bat, try these things and see if they help. There are a lot of really cool techniques out there. Okay, stabilization. This is a very, very big field. Again, I'm not saying these things are required whatsoever. I just want you to leave this presentation knowing what's out there. So when you come across an article, you come across someone in the field using these one of things, you'll say, oh yeah, Court was talking about this. Now I know why you're using that. So we'll start off with a macro clip. This is something I got a few years ago that I like a lot. I think this is made by Wimberly. Yeah, Wimberly. And basically, you could probably make this on your own if you're crafty. It's a clamp right here that clamps onto your tripod, and then it's a little clip up here that will actually stabilize the stem of the flower that you're trying to photograph. You can do indoor photography with flower cuttings, and you can put this in your tripod, and you can put the flower here in this clamp, and you can use this to completely bend and move it exactly where you want it. In addition, as you'll see in a few slides, this is critical to taking macro photographs without a flash, because you need to have those longer shutters and you don't want your subject to be moving around. So I was really into super macro photography a few years ago, and every little micron of movement of anything, even if it's a completely still day outside, it screws up the photo, so you have to stabilize stuff. So this is a pretty cool little trick. Not a lot of money, but a niche product nonetheless. A tripod, tripods, I always tell people I'm in the school of thought that I don't use a tripod when I can help it, because I'm usually photographing animals that do move. Most of what I'm photographing nowadays is bigger stuff that can move literally from one side of the safari vehicle to the other. But even with macro photography, I want to be prepared to move around. If you are photographing still objects, flowers, food, textures, fabric, a tripod is your friend. You can shoot it slower. You can position it, you can take multiple photographs of the same thing. In addition, you do need something to clamp that thing down on. There's no sense in stabilizing the flower stem and the flower if your camera's not stabilized. So those two things kind of go hand in hand. Tripod with certain situations, yeah, it's helpful. And then nowadays, the really cool thing, I think maybe 7 years ago, Canon came out with an image stabilized macro lens. Their very venerable 100mm f2.8. That is really helpful. It eliminates a lot of your own hand movement. Still, I think that stabilization in lens for macro photography is not super common. I could be wrong, but that's another way you can stabilize as well. Okay, moving on. I had a question about this in Macro 101. What is a focusing rail? When do I use it? Do I need it? So this is what a focusing rail looks like. And what it does is it allows you to have your subject, this is usually like museum specimens, you'll see here, and you can make minute adjustments. The reason I show this is to show you the complexity that you have to have surrounding a macro focusing rail. This is generally not for we field photographers. I mean, a lot of people out there like me, like I'm going to my backyard and going on a nature trail, I'm on safari, I'm walking around a camp, like I'm an authority on this. So if you wish to get more into it, I would recommend doing some internet searches. But the basic gist is you can take one of your lenses, the Nifty 50 is one of the most popular that I show here, and you can actually buy an adapter. The first person to do this, or the initial people to do this, just did it with duct tape and some plexiglass or some PVC pipe. So you can do it on your own. I'm always wary to do that with expensive camera gear, but essentially what you're doing is normally you take this end, put it in the camera, you're actually flipping it around. So take a look at this photo right here, this lens. This is, one of your classic zoom lenses, and they flipped it around. The best way I can describe how this works, I'm not going to go into like the optical physics, but have you ever had a guide show you that if you turn your binoculars around, you can actually use it as a microscope with something you're holding in your hand? Say you look at like a fern leaf and you're looking at all the little pores and pollen and whatnot. You can actually do that because the way the optics work when you switch it around, you can actually get a lot closer to things, and it magnifies in a weird way. You can never look at binoculars the other way around and see birds, but if you are looking at a subject within like a few inches or a foot, it works in a different way. It's like a reciprocal kind of light transmission thing. So nowadays they have these adapters. They're usually like the good ones that actually sync with your camera, where you can still control the aperture of the lens and all that stuff. They're usually like a couple $100. It is a hack, but it's a great way to get this extreme super macro, like well beyond the lenses you would normally think of. And this is when you see these photographs online, which I absolutely love, of like jumping spiders and these really colorful little things. I mean, this guy is like literally the size of a grain of rice. Yet these people are able to take macro photographs of this with these reverse lenses, and it's like a total sensation. If you're not familiar with it, just Google macro jumping spider photos and prepare to be blown away. These little beauties are so fascinating. So this is one of the ways they do it. Another question, a note on bellows, like do I need bellows? So this is, in my opinion, a little bit more of an antiquated form of a macro hack. This used to be popular before extension tubes and reverse lenses, but nevertheless, we're getting into optical physics. This is what it looks like. Again, I'm just trying to show you these things so you know what they are. It's essentially something that attaches between your lens and the camera. It increases the distance, and you're messing with the magnifying power. So it's very much like when you switch lenses on a microscope. The distance of the lens to the actual viewfinder affects how much magnifying it is. These are tricky, they're kind of clunky, they're not really field worthy, again, for a museum collection. So I don't necessarily recommend them for the field. The reverse lens I think is way better personally. And then nowadays you have these things called extension tubes. Very similar as the bellow. It doesn't have that accordion-like thing, so it's not as adjustable. But basically you buy these little things. This is the extension tube right here. The good ones come with these little pins that actually connect to your lens and sync and talk to your camera back and forth. And so the camera can actually adjust the settings. It can adjust the aperture and the shutter speed and all this stuff, even autofocus in some cases. And it makes that distance greater between your sensor and the lens, and it adds magnifying power. Okay, so here's my overall take on those last three hacks. The thing is that anytime you put something between your specialty made lens and your specialty made camera that want to talk to each other, and the glass is high end and the sensor is high end, is you're injecting another element that you don't have necessarily a lot of control over. In addition, if you want to get decent quality ones, you're going to have to pay a couple $100s for. So ultimately, and this might be naive on my part, people can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've found that kind of the best use of that couple $100s is to invest in a dedicated macro lens. It talks to your camera better. You have better autofocus. I think it's better image results. It's going to be better for your fundamentals. So rather than taking one of the lenses you already have and buying a couple $100 nice extension tube like this, I recommend looking at one of the macro setups, for your camera from your camera manufacturer. But again, there are also I'm not telling you that's the best way. That's just my personal way. There are a lot of tricks and tips out there for macro photography. So the difference in macro lenses. So what you want to do if you're shopping for a macro lens is you want to look for a dedicated macro. 100 millimeters doesn't mean it's a macro. If it's a 100 millimeter macro, it's a 100 millimeter macro. So usually, on camera websites, there's a whole dedicated section of macros. Most manufacturers have like 1, 2. Canon has 3, 4 technically. So here's the thing: is that all these lenses operate on this 1-to-1 macro ratio. Remember I was talking about that before, in that the size of the critter or the flower or the whatever will appear the same size in your sensor when you have this 1-to-1 macro ratio. So it doesn't totally matter which focal length you use. At full macro, you're gonna be at 1-to-1. That image is gonna appear the same as in life size, okay? The difference is actually this bottom row here, which is, it's like the minimum and like sort of maximum focusing distance, meaning that if you want to get that true 1-to-1 ratio and make that thing as big as possible in your camera, in the frame, these are the distances you need to be from that subject. They're not huge, not a huge difference. This is 3.5 inches, this is 6 inches, 9.5 inches, from a 60 to 100 to 180 millimeter. But what that means is you don't have to get that close. So the quintessential problem here is, say you see this beautiful beetle or this butterfly or this lizard in your backyard. If you have a 60 millimeter, you're still going to get, you know, a similar shot as these others, but you've got to get 3.5 inches away from it. With animals, that can be challenging. You know, not all animals let you get that close. So as a result, you know, your 100 millimeter macro is kind of like the standard. It's the gold standard. This is what most people will use as their go-to. But you can get even farther away with your 180 millimeter macro. The thing with this though is that it's a big lens. It's like the same size, if you're familiar with what a 7-200 is, or a 100 to 400. Like it's chunky. I don't have the 180. You can see here, I have the 100 on here. You can see here, you know, about the size of my hand, more or less. The 180 is like a telephoto zoom lens. It's pretty big. I don't frankly know many people with that lens, but anyway, again, tools for you to go forward with. Okay, so challenges and solutions. Dipping back into macro photography 101, this is important enough that I need to say it again. You've got to be aware of your depth of field issues. Your depth, how much is ultimately in focus, is entirely in relation to how big that subject or how much of the frame that subject takes up. Okay, so with macro photography, we have a very unique challenge, because normally you'd think, okay, aperture f5.6, that's a pretty moderate, you know, maybe f8 if I want a really wide depth of field, maybe even f11. Because the subject is usually like edge to edge of the frame, if you shoot at one of these lower f numbers, you're not going to get everything in focus. And this is kind of artsy. I think it's beautiful in its own way. But look, you know, one of the coolest parts, the shield of this shield bug, is out of focus. And I think there'd be some really nice texture here, just like the texture here. And I missed out on that. I actually did this intentionally for educational purposes, but I missed out on this because I didn't shoot with a wide enough depth of field. So you have to really understand that if you want everything in your individual critter or your flower or whatever to be in focus, you have to shoot at a really artificially high aperture. Now, point and shoot cameras often can't go above f8. Sometimes the amount of light you have, maybe you don't have a big flash, maybe you don't want to use any flash at all, which we'll get to in the next couple slides. There is a trick. All you got to do is make that subject a smaller part of your frame. It sounds simple, but that's basically the gist, is that, you know, back up. You will no longer be at a true 1-to-1 macro. You know, you're not getting that insect as big as it possibly can in the screen. But what you can with these modern day cameras, you know, a lot of them are like 20 megapixels, 25 megapixels, 30 megapixels, is you can pull back a little bit, make it smaller, still focus on that thing, and then plan on cropping later. So this is the original shot. This is my crop shot. And you can see much more of my shot here is in focus, but I was forced to use that lower aperture number, okay? Okay, we're gonna quickly elevate into a relatively complicated topic. This is one I don't talk about this a lot because it usually doesn't come up, but with macro photography and advanced macro photography, as this is something also to be aware of. Just will pause quickly as I take a sip. So lens diffraction limits. I'm sure there are entire college courses on what this means, and the way that light works through small apertures, or small openings to things like apertures and cameras and whatnot. The basic gist, I'm just going to boil it down to what you need to know, is that when you are using these big aperture numbers like f11, f16, as I do recommend to start off with, you're generally going beyond the sweet spot for your camera. And this is always a bit of like a bummer to hear, because you just think, oh, well, if my f number is bigger and bigger, it's going to be crisper and crisper and better and better. That's not actually true. So most cameras nowadays, it's all in relation to your sensor size and the amount of megapixel. It basically comes down to a couple different things. The light entering your camera scatters, and then also as your pixels get more and more defined with these higher apertures, they actually start crowding out the other pixels on your sensor. So this is why what we call full frame cameras generally perform better in these situations, because there's more space for these pixels to fit. But imagine, you have to fit 20 shapes into a square foot, and you're given 20 squares and then 20 little gear shaped things with like 12 angles to them. Chances are you're gonna be able to fit those squares a lot better because they have less edges to them. So as you're getting more and more definition in your photo, you're actually, and here's the big takeaway, you're losing resolution in your sweet spot. So what this all means is that, yes, I think you should shoot at f/16 in these cases because you get that beautiful crisp depth of field. You can shoot at, you can get this cool texture of the leaf, the texture of the butterfly, but you got to be careful that if you go too high of an aperture, when you zoom in, like if you were to compare two shots side by side in Photoshop or Lightroom, and you're shooting one at around f/10 and one at f/16, that sweet spot, like the actual area that you're focusing on, will probably look better at f/10 versus f/16. At the end of the day, and stay with me here, I'm going to move on to some easier topics here. This is a really crazy one. But at the end of the day, what you really want is the whole frame to have that nice wide depth of field. So yes, my pixel quality deteriorates a little bit as I go higher and higher apertures, but I am thinking quite literally and metaphorically about the big picture when I get into those numbers. If you wish to learn more on this, I highly recommend you Google literally this, diffraction limit 4, and then your camera make and model. Okay, because every camera is a little bit different, and what it's going to tell you is where your sweet spot is for your camera, like f/8 or f/9 or f/10 or f/11. Usually it's in that range. As we fit more and more megapixels into these cameras, that sweet spot is getting lower and lower. So like for instance, Canon came out with this crazy camera a couple of years ago that has like 50 megapixels, very specialty camera. As a result, its sweet spot, like where its pixels will be sharpest at the focus point, is like f/6.3 or f/7.1. So anyway, I don't want to go too much into this because I probably have lost some people. It's if you haven't really seen this, it's hard to internalize, but nevertheless, recommend you look at it a little bit more, check it out. Okay, this is another thing that we talked about last week, but I want to go into more because this kind of gets us into the next level of macro photography, is if you want to get away from flash and when to do it, how to do it. Let's talk about first, why flash may not be the most desirable for all of your macro photography. Again, I always start out with flash at first because in a lot of cases with wildlife photography and a lot of cases with the group photography, I don't have infinite chances to take the perfect photo. I want to get in there and get out of there and let my group take some photos. So right off the bat, for the amount of time you spend, it's going to produce the most pleasing effects, in my humble opinion. This is a flash photo, great depth of field. It's got good crisp sharpness on the hairs of the moth, good colors, kind of some cool texture of the leaves in the background. But you notice that the light fall off is pretty severe. This is like actually in the day. This is a moth that was flew in the night before, and you get this light fall off. Why does this happen? Well, it's known, again, another complicated slide, but the inverse square law. This is just kind of like a picture to make myself look fancy and impressive, but really what it comes down to is that there's this extraordinary light fall off for every unit of distance you go further and further away from the flash. So since I actually have my flash with me today, so if I were at say 1 inch from the flash, I'm at 100% of whatever lumens or value. If I go 8 inches away, I'm at 2% of that same light. Now, because these flashes are so darn powerful, 8 inches is still a fine distance, but you can start to realize that when you start to go 1 inch to 8 inches to 18 inches to 2 feet to 3 feet to 5 feet to like 18 feet sometimes in the background, that light that you're using to light your subject and to get that really big aperture and big depth of field falls off and makes everything completely dark. So as a result, you get photos like this in the daytime. And actually, for a lot of cases, this is fine with me. I mean, I don't have a big problem with it. I think it's aesthetic. For this one, it totally complements this little draft neck weevil in Madagascar really well. So it's not a total bad thing to me, but oftentimes, you will benefit, you will want to get this shot without flash if you have the time. I can't tell you how many butterflies that I've seen across the world that you would think would fly off at any person approaching a close distance to just stay there, and they're patient. So it is indeed possible. So what are the techniques for keeping a natural background? Well, first of all, I recommend for starters, don't use flash. If you're really after it, you can dial in your flash to very, very low settings. But you ultimately need to bring that F number down so you don't have to rely on a big bright flash, and then shoot to crop. And what I mean by that is the same thing as the little frog photo I showed a few slides back. Pull out a little bit, zoom back. If you do have a zoom, step back a couple steps, make the initial shot, the subject a little further away, a little bit smaller part of your frame. So when you do have those shallower depth of fields like F5.6, F7.1, F8, what you're focusing on remains tack sharp, and you get that nice bokeh or bokeh in the background. I will tell you, pro tip, butterflies are a wonderful thing to photograph in macro. They can be a little bit flighty, pun intended, but the main thing is that the way that they are formed, we call it in entomology dorsal ventrally flattened. So they're kind of like up and down, like most of the body is all in one plane away from me. What that means is you can get really sharp photos because the whole butterfly is like mostly the same distance from me to it. Notice here, good example of what I'm talking about, just like a couple millimeters away, the second antenna is not in focus, but the whole body is. This antenna is in focus. You can tell millimeters of distance make a difference when you're at those shallow depth of fields with macro photography. The other thing you can do, again, I touched on this when I went over the gear, is that if you are shooting at a slower shutter speed, which is often necessitated by a macro mode, a depth of field mode, stabilizing your subject with these clamps is really, really nice. You can see here an inventive way. I just grabbed this from the internet, clamping onto a tree and then holding these flowers. I don't ever advocate, picking flowers just for a macro shot. I'm hoping this person maybe found this already cut down or something, or maybe you have some ornamental flowers that you bought from the store in your own home. A great technique to do so. And then it also allows you, again, to shoot at that lower shutter speed while also maintaining a good depth of field. And it's all about that ratio. Okay, moving on here to some of the more general advice. This can be for point and shoots. This is any sort of macro photography. It's one of these things that you probably already know inside your head, but I want to emphasize it because it's super important with macro photography. Choose your background. Choose what goes behind your subject. We don't always have the luxury of moving around and pivoting and rotating around a subject, but you'd be surprised how often we do. So very often what I'll do is approaching a scene that I think a good macro shot would be used for, I will take a photo just to not disturb the animal, and then as I get the shot, people get the shot, maybe I'll just slowly, stealthily creep around and start looking at what the background looks like. Like, what is behind the animal? What is behind the flower? What color is it? What texture is it? Et cetera, et cetera. So here's a great example. We've got a little butterfly in Borneo, and you can see here there's nice green. You may not have known it right off the bat, but essentially this is going to be a leaf. This is the midrib, the vein. But there's a different color background had I been a little bit pivoted this way, and be kind of like this brown, a little bit drab, not what I wanted. Now this butterfly happened to be like at that plane where I wanted to shoot it straight on here, but it was also dancing around a little bit, and I had opportunities to choose my background. So I chose this nice, brilliant green over this brown. Be cognizant of your background. Try to pick the color and the texture that you want. So here's an example where I actually will pivot around this little lizard in Honduras. I like this shot, kind of interesting. Some people may not like, the leaves coming out of its nose in the background. I think it's, natural, it's fine, it's cool. But you might want to pivot a little bit, and like, what is going to be behind this animal? So as I pivot, of course, the thing moves a little bit and takes a look at me. But I think this is actually quite cool. These fronds of this cycad, I believe, they're really jagged, like nice kind of fringe here, little translucence here, but this background is different and it might be nicer to you. In addition, even if you are using flash, those last few photos were without flash, think about your background with flash too. Think about that light rule where I say the light falls off so dramatically, like every inch, every foot beyond, there's not gonna be light. So pick subjects that are actually close. If you remember that photo with the moth, had leaves that were almost touching the entire moth. pick a background that's close when you're using flash, and you get a lot more of that color, texture, and lighting around it. Also, choose your foreground if you can. Little butterfly, a snout butterfly, as they call it here in Sichuan, China. Think about the foreground too. Is there stuff in front of it? This is one of these classic shots where I step away a little bit. I move away a little bit to make that subject a smaller part of my scene. Did not have a flash with me, so I was shooting, I think, at like f5.6, f7.1, whatever the light conditions would allow. So as a result, I want it smaller in my screen. And that gives me an opportunity to involve some other cool things. Use some of the leading line principles here with this. This is kind of pointing the viewer in the direction of this butterfly. I've got some cool wispy fronds back here. I've got some cool textures here. Think about what else appears in your scene. I think with macro, we often get caught up in the fact that, like, oh, make it big, make a small thing big, and focus on that, and then don't worry about anything else. Get the right settings, get the f16, get the flash right, and then whatever else is just there. And that's fine. I've got a lot of great photos that way too. But if you take it one level further and start thinking about, ooh, well, if I move a little bit this way, I can get this in the background and make a next level of better shot that you will ultimately like better. Okay, quick note on how to photograph flying stuff. This is always a question that I get. Bees, pollinators, things in your backyard. It's tough, let me tell you. So I, again, stick with the flash. I stick with my kind of f11 to f16 settings. What I do is going to be very short, and you can adapt this, and we could probably talk at length about this, but my very basic starter kit, my starter set, is you pick an area that you think that flying thing is going to be at, whether it's going to hover in that area, whether it's going to fly through that area, whether it's a flower that you're like, ooh, that's one of the open flowers. It's gotta land on that eventually if I sit here for a minute. Focus on that and hold your position, and don't shoot until the animal comes to you into that exact scene. Trying to track a moving fly, a moving bee with a macro within 2 feet is way harder than photographing birds in flight. So just think about that, pick your spot. This is why it's always great to go with a guide, is we can kind of anticipate, like, ooh, that flower has not yet been pollinated. We can kind of see it's putting out the cues. Bees will be attracted to this one. Focus on it, hang out there, get ready for the shot, get your settings right, and then once it flies into frame, then take the shot. With that wide depth of field, that f16, it gives you some room for error if it's not perfectly where you expected it to be. As we wrap up here, so remember, get your questions in if you do have any. I'd love to entertain those for the last bit of the talk. We want to talk about post-processing a little bit. Again, I could do a whole nother talk on post-processing just for macro photography, but if you are dabbling in Lightroom or Photoshop or any of the other tools out there, and you're like, well, I don't really know where to begin with macro photography, it seems so different. These are the things that I generally go to: clarity, my black slider, my contrast slider, and my sharpness. Macro photographs, in my opinion, they stand out because they're textured. They have interesting things going on. Like, who would have ever thought that the body of this moth, looked like a throw pillow? That is really cool stuff. That's what I want to showcase. And things like clarity and blacks, like to make those blacks richer and deeper, darks, contrast, increasing the lights and the darks, and then overall sharpness. I very, very rarely use overall sharpening to my photos, but macro, since usually the subject is the majority of my scene, the sharpness works really, really well. And then finally, before we get into the homework assignment, techniques for approaching animals with macro. So something that was very important, it was brought up last time, is like, well, how do you safeguard animals against your sort of intrusion, against the flash? I am very, very judicious. I will stay at a flower to photograph it a lot longer than I will a gecko or a butterfly even. As an environmental conservation biologist, I recommend, if you do have animals that are nocturnal, like this leaf-tailed gecko in Madagascar, if you have animals with big eyes, this is like a weird generalization, but big eyes and weird looking eyes, they're usually very, very night adapted, and they may not be totally used to seeing bright light. So I, as a conservation photographer, feel that when I can get a shot of this and I can tell the story, when I can post it online, I can get it to a travel catalog or a biological textbook, I am doing some really, really good stuff for the species and for conservation, because I'm showcasing stuff that's just never been seen before. And you're doing the same thing when you're joining a NatHab trip and photographing this stuff in Madagascar. You are a conservation photographer too. So although, yeah, I mean, this thing probably doesn't want a bright light flashed at it at all, I am being very judicious and maybe taking 1 or 2 photographs and then moving on. And chances are this critter is never going to see another flash ever again, frankly. So I do view, you have to be conscientious and cautious going into it. But my technique with this is if I'm going to shoot maybe 2 or 3 photos of this guy, I'm going to start off a little bit further back. Remember, you can always crop into photos and you're going to get even better depth of field if you do make a smaller part of your scene. So I'm going to start back, about like 6 feet. I'm going to line it up in my frame. Go ahead and hold the camera here since I have it. I'm going to line it up in my frame and I'm going to take a shot. I've got it. If it skedaddles and moves on, at least I have the shot. At least I have something. It's not as ideal as I'd like it, but I have something. And then I slowly move forward. And I've noticed, I don't know if it's just superstition or what, but I've noticed if I take a shot far away and then move a foot closer and take another shot, it's almost as if the animal is getting used to me and like knows that I'm not a threat. There is no data and biological information to support that, but I've noticed it for 20 years, countless expeditions, countless macro photography. If I start further away of animals that are likely to move and spook, I notice a lot more success. So kind of like moving in, this goes for flash or no flash, the principles are the same. Start back, make sure you get the shot. Sometimes animals will move, you'll miss the shot, but at least you got something that you can work with, and then gradually move closer until you're happy with it. Again, keeping in mind with nocturnal animals, with things with big eyes, weird eyes, just being sensitive that you want these guys to be happy and healthy after you photograph it too. Okay, so homework time if you choose to partake. So last week I kind of talked about, just general backyard photography. Something I think would be cool now is atypical macro shots of non-little things. So everything I've been talking about so far is, photographing these small, minute things, lizards and geckos and beetles and butterflies. But there is a lot more to macro photography than just that. Look around your home. We're in our homes a lot more these days. Look for things with high texture and color. Fruits and veggies, totally fair game. I love photographing coffee beans. I think it's really cool to see them up close. Photograph fractions of the whole. This is not that you have chameleons in your backyard, but this is a chameleon in Madagascar. And this chameleon was yay big. I mean, it was a big chameleon. It was not a macro subject, but it was very docile. It was just sitting on a branch. And I can actually take a macro shot of its skin. You can do so with your pet's hair. You can do so with leather on couches. You can do so with tablecloths and fabrics. It gives you really, really good tools to use in the field once you get to do so. And then as you're doing this in your backyard or your kitchen and looking for things for your homework assignment, look for things with water droplets. One of the things I was almost tempted to say in my gear section is some macro photographers will actually go out with like a water spritzer, like the same thing you'd use to water your plants. And if they see a beautiful flower in their backyard or on the trail, they might give it a little spritz, a little morning dew to get that shot. This was not done that way. This was a butterfly that just happened to have some dewdrops on it. But I think when you incorporate and integrate that interesting background, these interesting textures, these water droplets can really be subjects to the photo themselves. So that's really cool stuff. Okay, so last thing, quick plug for our nature tutorial website here at Natural Habitat Adventures, The Natural Photographer. We post often on tips and tricks and settings and what I bring in my camera bag for certain trips. So check it out, naturalphotographer.org. We're posting often. And if you have any suggestions on what to post next, you can always write a comment in this platform here. You can ask a question. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. We'll take questions now. And also check out that nice background, right? Like I pivoted to get that nice bright yellow background on this. Anyway, without further ado, Kendall, do we have some questions today?
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much, Court. And I'd like to remind folks that if you do have questions, you can submit those in the questions field in your control panel. Okay, we had a couple spots where the audio cut out a little bit, so there's someone who would like you to re-explain just very quickly reverse lenses.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, reverse lenses. Where's my handy dandy? Oh, here we go. So reverse lenses, basically you take the lens and you will need an adapter. This is something you buy. Back in the day, you could make these. I mean, you can still make them, but the initial ones were just made with PVC pipe and a bunch of duct tape. But basically this is normally the part that fits onto your camera. Instead, you flip it around and these adapters have the threads and the screws necessary to turn it around and actually put this to the camera. The interesting thing with that is that ultimately results in you being able to have higher magnification and focus closer on things for super macro photography. So reverse lenses is a hack. It's kind of like a shortcut, but it's a really helpful shortcut for really macro photography. And again, if you've ever seen these photos of jumping spiders, it's very niche, but like Google jumping spiders macro photography online, and you're going to see the most incredible photos out there. And most of it's made with these reverse lenses. You just take any lens you have. In fact, the less focal length you have, the more magnification you get, just from the reverse like reciprocation of it all. I'm not going to go into the physics, but yeah, pretty much any lens will work. 50-50. The 50 1.4 is a 2. I think just because it's easy to use.
And could you repeat a little bit more about focusing rails?
Yes, focusing rails. So they're basically a tripod mount that will allow you to make micro adjustments to how far and how close your lens is. You need a tripod to the subject. So this is often used for things like museum photography of specimens, for small photography, super macro photography for flowers. My general point is, like, I want you to know that they're there, but they're usually too complicated for the average macro photographer. Also, you have to, like, one of the main advantages to the rail itself is that you can be lined up with the exact same framed shot, but take the photo at different depths of fields, or more importantly, at different focal lengths. So what happens is, let's just take a flower. You will focus with a wide depth of field still on the closest petal, and then you'll gradually get closer. And so you get this crazy wide depth of field for very small things with macro photography.
And does the minimum focusing distance for a macro lens change with an APS-C sensor versus a full frame sensor?
That's a great question. So what that means is crop frame versus full frame cameras. So usually intro cameras are crop frame. They have a smaller frame, but they give you bigger magnification power. I don't think so. I'm not 110% sure, but I don't think the minimum focusing distance changes at all. What happens with crop frame is it's actually the space of the lens to the sensor that changes. It does give you more magnification power, but all those minimum numbers are pretty much going to be the same. I'm like 95% sure.
Great. What are the pros and cons of focus peaking for assisting with manual focus?
I'm sorry, was that focus peaking?
Yes.
I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that. Focus peaking is, yeah, honestly, I'm not familiar. So with manual focus versus autofocus, I mean, I think the main thing is that, you want to be on autofocus more often than not, but generally you want to be at the minimum focusing distance if you want that full macro ability, that one-to-one ability. Yeah, you may have stumped me on that one. I'm not really sure.
Okay. Are VR macro lenses worth the extra money?
Yeah, so VR is vibration reduction. That's Nikon's version of, if you're a Canon person, IS is image stabilization. Yeah, I think they are. It's usually, it's kind of substantial. You might be in like the $300-400 range. It might add 30, 40, 50% of the cost to it. But they are so helpful for when you need them. I think they're pretty darn good. If you are thinking, well, okay, I can either buy one macro lens with vibration reduction, or I can buy two lenses with one without VR and then a whole different kind of lens, maybe increase your possibilities by spreading the money further. But vibration reduction is so helpful because there's always those cases where you do want to minimize your own hand movement, and that's the main utility of VR.
How far does a ring light light up the subject?
So generally, anytime you're focusing with macro, you are within a foot. You are within a foot. So I don't want to say it doesn't matter if it's outside of a foot, but when these ring lights are rated and calibrated, and you're getting a good one versus a bad one, everything's thinking about, like, is it going to light up within a foot or two, basically. I can tell you it's totally correlated to how much money you spend. totally correlated to the quality of it. You know, to have the technology to light up more, it means more LEDs, means more technology. So in general, you know, they're all going to work because most of the time you're going to be photographing within a foot or two, and they're going to light it up just fine. If you want to use a ring light for something that's like further in the distance, I've actually tried this before with a zoom lens, photographing nocturnal lemurs in Madagascar, and it didn't cut it. Yeah, the ring light didn't work. It's probably because this is a cheaper ring light and it's an LED based ring light. But generally, yeah, with macro specific flashes, they're not even really designed to flash and to do anything outside of a couple of feet. So they're going to be pretty similar.
Okay. And what's the best way that you accommodate for wind or breeze?
Yeah, so you want to try to reduce it as much as possible. You might want to position yourself to break, like, you know, break that current. So you're kind of like in between the flower and where the wind's coming from. That's helpful. Alternatively, having that fast shutter speed. If it's just a gentle breeze, you know, you might be able to use a fast enough shutter speed, like 1/200, 1/250. Again, the flash sync restrictions will actually have a lot to do with it. Like you usually can't shoot at infinite shutter speeds because the flash has to sync to that very fast shutter. Alternatively, I have used this guy before, this little clamp. They're called macro clamps if you want to Google it, macro clamp. And again, this can clamp to anything. You can even clamp it to the ground, or you can clamp it to the tree and then use this to clamp the branch. That helps a little bit. If it's really howling, you might want to pick a different time of day. I mean, really, wind can be an issue.
Okay, great. So it's getting close to the top of the hour, so that's the last question we'll have time for today. So I'd like to hand things back over to you for some closing comments.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, guys. Well, this concludes the two-part foray into macro photography. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. You know, shoot us a question if you have anything follow up. I'll have to look up that focus peaking one. It might just be a terminology I'm not familiar with. It sounds familiar, sort of, but I'll get back to you on that. You know, tune into Natural Photographer for more tips and tricks across the world. And I would love to see you in the field sometime. It'd be great to shoot alongside you on some proboscis bugs in Borneo or something fun like that. So thanks, guys, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Court. We always learn so much from you. This is wonderful. And my thanks to everyone who joined us today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have that replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.